Hey, today is going to be a really incredibly interesting session. But before we begin, I want to tell you that knowledge is knowing what to do. Wisdom is knowing why to do it. And so today we're going to be talking about why to do so many of the things that I've told you to do and will tell you to do in future sessions. Are you going to learn a technique today? Are you going to learn something that you really didn't know and you're going to be able to do something you couldn't do before? Not really. That's not what this session is about. This session is so that you will understand the underlying why all these other things work and why all these other things are true and what it is that holds all of these techniques together and binds them up into one powerful body of knowledge. So stay with me. Some people would use the term philosophical. It's not. It's scientific, but it frames an overview. Are you ready? Dr. Roger Sperry won the Nobel Prize in Physiology in 1981 for his documentation of brain lateralization. Now that basically says that we don't have one brain divided into two hemispheres, left and right, as much as we have two separate competing brains. Do you remember when we talked about duality and we talked about justice and mercy? When you have to choose between the two, you're choosing between two good things. So those are the hardest choices in life. How about freedom and responsibility? They often come into conflict, but they're both good things. Now, all of that idea of duality is going to make so much more sense. As a matter of fact, things like the Myers-Briggs type indicator, we have the introverts and the extroverts and the thinkers and the feelers, and then you have the sensing versus the intuitive, and you have the judging versus the perceiving. You know, all of those dichotomies, they just make so much more sense when you really understand brain lateralization. It's going to be a longish session. I'll try to make it as interesting as possible, and it will definitely be valuable. So stay with me. Now, Dr. Roger Sperry said, each hemisphere of the brain is indeed a conscious system in its own right, perceiving, thinking, remembering, reasoning, willing, and emoting, all at a characteristically human level. And both the left and right hemisphere may be conscious simultaneously in different, even in mutually conflicting mental experiences that run along in parallel. The reason that we're so often struggle with things is because we have two separate competing brains that have completely separate perspectives and fundamental belief systems. And you're going, really? That's a little bit scary. We're just getting started. Now, can we use the properties of the left hemisphere of the brain, the logical, rational, sequential, deductive reasoning left hemisphere? Can we use those to our advantage and persuasion? Yes, we can. And how about the anything goes, unfiltered, open all night, and ready for an adventure right hemisphere of the brain? Is there a way we can harness that? Oh yeah. You see, the right hemisphere of the brain doesn't know true from false. It doesn't care. That's the left brain's job. The right hemisphere of the brain doesn't know fact from fiction. This is why we love fiction books. This is why we go to movies that are completely fictional and we laugh, we cry, we get frightened, we have heart palpitations, we're worried about these imaginary characters as though they were real. Because in the right hemisphere of the brain, they are real. You see, the right hemisphere doesn't know true from false, fact from fiction. That's why we can go to places in our imaginations that don't exist. So stay with me. Very useful stuff. Barry Moser is an artist, and he said, good composition is a matter of establishing and controlling tensions between opposites. And then, of course, Niels Bohr, not a philosopher. Niels Bohr, from the 1927 Solvay Conference, was a winner of the Nobel Prize in Physics. Physics, not philosophy, but what did he say? The opposite of a correct statement is a false statement. But the opposite of a profound truth may well be another profound truth. F. Scott Fitzgerald, that wrote The Great Gatsby, said the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. That's what you're going to have to do as a writer. You're going to have to hold that duality in your mind and still retain the ability to function and not diminish one truth in favor of the other truth. And then Stanislaw Lech, another writer, a Soviet dissident, he died in 1966. He said, "Proverbs contradict each other. That is the wisdom of a people." We don't have time to go into it today, but I have a list of famous sayings, proverbs you've heard your whole life, and they contradict each other. This one contradicts that one, this one contradicts that one. When you get them both together, you realize those are actually mutually exclusive, yet they're both true. In your required reading, or in this case, your required video viewing, you met Professor Ken Robinson. Now, Ken Robinson is part of an interesting group. One of the statements he made in speaking to this group, he said, "Employers are already saying that a degree is not enough and that many graduates do not have the qualities they're looking for. The ability to communicate, to work in teams, to adapt, to change, to innovate and be creative. This is not surprising. The traditional academic curriculum is not designed to promote creativity. Complaining that the system does not produce creative people is like complaining that a car doesn't fly. It was never intended to." Now, the group he's part of is called the 21st Century Learning Initiative. It's a group of scientists and psychologists and educators committed to educational reform. So, obviously, Professor Ken Robinson, one of the great heroes of the American Small Business Institute. Now, Dr. Albert Schenker was president of the American Federation of Teachers when he said this way back in 1997. He said, "The factory was the inspiration for our current educational model. But America's old-fashioned factories are dead or dying, and the limitations of America's traditional factory model of education have become manifest, and they are crippling." He was talking about educating only the rational, logical, sequential, deductive reasoning left hemisphere of the brain. That's what he's talking about. Part of what we're going to do for you is give you some remedial education for the other half of your brain, the right hemisphere, the neglected hemisphere, the artistic hemisphere, the intuitive hemisphere, the hemisphere of the brain from which come gut feelings and hunches. How you know it's true, but you don't know how you know. Premonitions come from the right hemisphere of the brain. You see, it's all about pattern recognition. All of the functions of the right hemisphere, half of your brain, is about pattern recognition, sequences of events, patterns of behavior, or musical notes, or numbers. Patterns. Albert Einstein said, "It is in fact nothing short of a miracle that the modern methods of instruction have not yet entirely strangled the holy curiosity of inquiry." For this delicate little plant, aside from stimulation, stands mainly in need of freedom. Without this, it goes to rack and ruin without fail. It is a very grave mistake to think that the engagement of seeing and searching can be promoted by means of coercion and a sense of duty. Energy. The energy in this little remote, according to Albert, is equal to its mass times the speed of light times the speed of light. He did not get there through logical, rational, sequential, deductive reasoning. He got there through an intuitive leap. And then he used logical, rational, sequential, deductive reasoning to prove that he was right. But it didn't begin in the left hemisphere. It began in the anything goes, pattern recognizing, right hemisphere. Now, this brain map that we're going to take a look at together was drawn by Dr. Silvia Helena de Cardosa from the Institute of Biophysics. Now, the pink part, this is the left hemisphere. The pink part is right behind your forehead. And the part here at the back of the brain is just above your spine at the base of your skull. Stay with me. Decisions, plans, and judgments. When the customer says, yes, I'll buy that today. Decisions, plans, and judgments come from the prefrontal cortex, the pink, right behind your forehead. Now, just beyond that, just past that, just forward of your left ear, is what's called the motor association cortex, and it's responsible for the coordination of action, physically coordinating muscles so that you can walk and you can throw and you can do all these voluntary things with your muscles. And then the coordination of action, there's the green. And then when you look at triggering this muscular action, there's that bright red stripe. That's the primary motor cortex. And of course, it triggers, and then it's actually coordinated there in the green part. And then the blue part next to it, really fascinating. This is pain, pressure, position, movement, and temperature. And so all of these tactile sensations are in the primary motor cortex. Tactile sensations. Pain, pressure, position, movement, and temperature. And you'll notice the blue flows down into the yellow, which is mental images. It's the multisensorial association area. Multisensorial, that means sounds and shapes and colors and symbols and every influence that you could possibly gather to have an opinion about something. It's all gathered into a composite that we will call a mental image. Now we'll look in a minute at where that mental image goes once it's gathered. But so far, all we've seen flowing into the yellow so far is pain, position, the position of a limb, or whether you're sitting or standing, you sense your position. Pressure, if you're feeling pressure on you, somebody's touching you or pushing you, you feel that. Movement, temperature, all the things that would be skin or muscular sensations in the blue, now flowing into the yellow to form mental images. But now, remember what I said just above your spine at the base of your skull? That's what your eyes are connected to by the optic nerves. They run from your eyeballs, between the two hemispheres of your brain, all the way back to this place just above your spine at the base of your skull. It's the furthest part of the brain from the part of the brain that determines, plans, decisions, and makes judgments, the part behind your forehead. It's a long and winding road, and lots of opportunities for false visual memories. Keep that in mind, because that's been proven countless times. Oh, by the way, the greatest lie you've ever been told is that we remember more of what we see than what we hear. It's complete crap. Clinical studies have demonstrated that to be utterly false countless times. But still people say that we remember more of what we see than what we hear, and it's in black and white and that's why it's reliable, and I saw it with my own eyes, as though that is somehow highly, when they talk about eyewitnesses, they think that somehow this is highly reliable as being fact, when in fact you have no sense that is less reliable than the memory of what you saw. And so the eyes, they flow up here to this orange part of the brain, which is visual memory, the visual association area. And then of course it flows up into the yellow. So now we have skin and muscular sensations from the dark blue, and then we have visual memories from the orange flowing up into the yellow, which is mental images. Here's where it's about to get interesting. Sounds come into the auditory cortex, a little brown oval you see right there, and they flow up into a little black circle. That's Broca's area, super important. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about Broca's area. But before we do, those sounds that come into the auditory cortex also go down into the temporal lobe, that big, huge blue oval. Now notice how all the other parts of the brain, the human brain, in the human brain, all the other parts of the brain fan out from that blue oval, like the tail feathers of a peacock. You see, we are creatures of sound. We'll talk more about that later. So sound flowing out into Broca's area. It's on a journey, just got started in Broca's area. It also flows down for storage into the memory of sound, which is the auditory association area. And it also flows up into mental images. And you're going, wait a minute, now we have eyes, ears, and skin. The orange, the light blue, and the dark blue. Eyes, ears, and skin. 3 separate organs in the body. Yes, skin is an organ. It's the largest organ in your body. Eyes, ears, and skin. 3 separate organs. Information is gathered from each of those 3 according to entirely separate and unrelated rules of information gathering, processing, storage, and retrieval. Eyes, ears, and skin gather, process, store, and retrieve information from 3 separate and largely unrelated parts of the brain. But yet we all call it memory, as though it's one thing. It's not one thing. It's 3 things joining in the multisensorial yellow part of the brain. This is all the left hemisphere, by the way. There are homonyms. There's an echo of associated areas in the right hemisphere, but the right hemisphere doesn't even look like the left. We'll talk about the Sylvan fissure or the Sylvan arch in a little bit. But for now, the memory of sound flows up into the yellow mental images. And then let's look back at that bright lime green circle. That's called Wernicke's area. In German, I think it's Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area. But in English, we tend to call it Wernicke's area. Now, this was discovered in 1874. Now, Wernicke's aphasia is when a person has had damage to Wernicke's area and they can speak, but they can't say nouns. They can't say the names of persons, places, and things because the part of their brain that would reach up and grab that from the light blue, that memory of what is the sound connected to that thing. I'm seeing the thing in my mind. What's called the visual spatial sketchpad. We'll talk more about that later, the mind's eye. So I'm seeing this thing in my mind, but I can't remember what to call it. And that's called Wernicke's aphasia. And so nouns, the names of persons, places, and things, notice where that lime green spot is bordered. Up above it are mental images. A mental image is if I say I have the blues. I have the blues. Now you and I both know we're talking about lethargy, apathy, mild depression, but that one syllable, blues, isn't referring to a color. It's referring to a very complicated idea with lots of other things associated with it. And all of the stuff's associated with this idea of the blues. That's attached to that sound, that one word, that noun, blues. In the the mental images part of the brain, the multisensorial association area, and it comes from Wernicke's area. That's the part of the brain that attaches the mental image or the word down below in the memory of sound, the light blue. That's what Wernicke's area does. Now, Wernicke's area is joined to Broca's area, which is up here. Remember we talked about that earlier, that little black thing, right just forward of your left ear, just forward of the auditory cortex. Now, Broca's area, unbelievably important if you're going to be persuasive. We're going to spend some time on Broca's area because unless you really understand this, you're always going to be frustrated. Broca's area has 3 functions, and 2 of those have been known since 1861. This is old, settled technology. We've known this forever. Notice, on 270 degrees of the perimeter of Broca's area is the part of the brain that coordinates muscular action. So our ability to speak, articulation, which is basically the coordination of diaphragm, larynx, lips, and tongue, to make all of these sounds called phonemes. All these 43 sounds in the English language from which we create the words to which we attach such complex meanings. And so our ability to speak, our ability to move our tongue, dental, palatal, labial, fricative, to be able to make these sounds in rapid succession, the ability to do that is because we have Broca's area. If animals had Broca's area, they could talk, but they don't. Only humans have Broca's area. Animals can only force air out of their lungs, and they can bark, whinny, neigh, bleat, moo, quack, but they don't have Broca's area. So they don't have the ability, even if they have a tongue, they don't have the ability to articulate that tongue to make all these specialized sounds. They can't coordinate diaphragm, larynx, lips, and tongue. So whenever you start thinking about what makes humans the most powerful authority on the planet, why are we in charge of everything? Why do we rule over all the other creatures? Well, according to Professor Steven Pinker, who for many years was the chair of the Department of Cognitive Science at MIT until Harvard Medical School stole him away, and then he was named a few years ago by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. Yeah, Steven Pinker, he says, we're in charge because we humans have this amazing gift of being able to attach complex meanings to sounds. Now, I'm going to take a quick detour. I'm going to come back to the brain. Our ability to attach meanings to sounds is the basis of communication because the written word has no meaning until it has been translated into the spoken word it represents. Until you hear the word in your mind, even if it is silently, even if it is only in what's called the articulatory loop, which is a function of working memory. We're going to talk about it in a little bit. But the same way that I said, we're going to talk about the visual spatial sketch pad, the mind's eye. Yeah. The articulatory loop is another function like that, where you hear things in your mind, but it's not sound. It's sound being rehearsed in working memory, which is simply consciousness. We're going to explain all this in a few minutes. But for now, just keep in mind that until those visual symbols, called the written word, have been translated into the sound they represent, the written word has no meaning. How many times have you been laying in bed reading a book, it occurs to you that you've been scanning this same sentence or paragraph over and over and over again, and you have no idea what it says? It's because the eyes are taking in the written symbol, but you're no longer translating that into the sound it represents. Remember, your eyes are connected to a totally different part of your brain than your ears. This is why we can follow a person who's speaking incredibly rapidly faster than we can read. We don't have to process the spoken word. We do have to translate the written word. We've talked about Broca's area. We've talked about our ability to articulate. Broca's area has a second function we've known about since 1861, and that's where we attach verbs, action words, to actions we're trying to describe. Now keep in mind, the reader, the listener, the viewer, the customer cannot take action until you have used a verb. You need to cause them to imagine taking that action. But if you say, imagine this, then you're an idiot. That's like saying, hey, get ready. I'm going to tell you a really funny joke. Are you ready? It's really funny. You don't want to warn people what you're about to do. You don't want to tell them how it is you're sneaking up on them. You just want to do it. You want them to find themselves having to deal with something. And the thing that separates bad communication from powerful communication is one word. This is the word predictability. Predictability is the silent assassin of persuasion, entertainment, and delight. Persuasion, entertainment, and delight can only happen when you do or say something new, surprising, or different. Therefore, the music that has nothing in it that is new, surprising, or different is tedious, derivative. That's what makes the joke funny, is how new, surprising, and different was the punchline, other than what you expected. Unusual, new, surprising, and different word combinations are more engaging than the predictable cliché phrases that most people use. So we know that Broca's area is responsible for articulation and for verbs, but the reason it's so powerful, and by the way, I apologize. This is really hard to find independent study materials about. And here's why. This third thing that Broca's area does, I taught it for a number of years, since about 1994. And then I wrote about it in 1999, or was it 1998 that The Wizard of Ads came out. And then in 1999, I wrote about surprising Broca in Secret Formulas of the Wizard of Ads. And I said, I can't prove this, but here's what I know to be true. Broca's area has a third function. This is the part that's hard to find other confirmation of, so I want to warn you about that. I said Broca's area is the part of the brain that anticipates the predictable. If you do or say what a person expected you to do or say, they will be bored. They will turn their attention, keep that in mind, they will turn their attention away from that which was predictable. It's called boring. That's what it is. And I said that's because Broca's area is always scanning the horizon of input for the new, the surprising, and the different, the unexpected. And it utterly ignores that which was expected. The predictable is ignored, constantly, quickly ignored. You're driving down a road, you drive down this road every day, you're doing 70 miles an hour. What do you notice? Only that which wasn't there yesterday. You only notice the new, the surprising, and the different. Which is why billboards tend to become invisible after they've been up for 30 or 60 days. I'm trying to give you some practical applications of some of this so that it doesn't seem like foo-foo philosophical things that aren't useful. So when I diverge to share how you can kind of use this stuff, it's so you'll understand the importance of this. So Broca's area, I decided, was the part of the brain that anticipated and discounted the predictable. And so anticipation, what part of the brain controls anticipation? The expectation of what's about to happen. Well, I said it was Broca's area. Well, I admitted in 1999 I had no proof of that. But in 2001, Professor Burkhard Maes, M-A-E-S-S, at the Max Planck Institute for Cognitive Neuroscience in Leipzig, Germany, was testing musically naive patients. He had an expectation that when we listen to music and we like it, it had something to do with Broca's area. He didn't know what, but he just had this intuition that Broca's area was involved in our ability to like music. Now remember, prior to that day, Broca's area was only known to have two functions. One was articulation, the ability to coordinate diaphragm, larynx, lips, and tongue so that we can speak, make sounds. And then the attachment of verbs, action words, to the actions we're trying to describe, the actions we want other people to see in their mind. That's the only thing we thought Broca's area did. So Burkhard Maes, he got what's called musically naive patients. These are people who could neither write music, read music, or play an instrument. They could appreciate music, but they didn't know anything about music. He had a large group of them. He brought them in one at a time, and it was magnetoencephalography, I believe. It might have been magnetic resonance. I'll have to double check. The point is, he's got equipment, and he's measuring the activity of Broca's area. And the only thing they were doing is when they would get the person there, they would play a series of musical chords, and then they're measuring what's going on in Broca's area. And they began to notice, anytime they played a chord out of sequence, big pulse of energy from Broca's area. And Burkhard Maes and his team were surprised because it was very reliable. And the first time they did it was an accident. Somebody playing the chord, I imagine it was a guitar, I don't know that, but in my imagination I've always believed it to be a guitar. And I said, so when they played a chord out of sequence, big pulse from Broca's area, and the scientists all freak out because Broca's area should have been deader than a bag of hammers because they're not thinking, they're not using any verbs and they're not coordinating any muscles. They're just lying there, without moving, and nobody said anything. And so it couldn't have been a verb, and it couldn't have been the articulation, the diaphragm, larynx, lips, and tongue. I'm going, dude, Broca's area anticipates the predictable. And when something new, surprising, or different happens, Broca's area comes alive. Now that and by the way, that's the closest thing I've ever found to real proof. Now, Dr. Friedrich Pulvermüller, another German doctor, proved a year or so later that my theory of mental images and how they're gathered. And by the way, I didn't draw the map. This was Dr. Silvia Helena de Cardoso, but the map is like the blueprint of a house. It explains so much if you just learn to read the map. But mental images being a composite of these other three senses, he was able to demonstrate and prove that. And so these things, at the time of this recording, I think they've been proven for the past 20 years, but they're not yet commonly taught. Do you know why? Because the people who discovered these things weren't necessarily credentialed to discover those things. And when you're an outsider in an area of specialists, they get very protective about their specialization. So when I say this is trustworthy, please believe me. And because even if I'm wrong, if you simply do what I'm telling you to do, as though Broca's area does what I'm telling you it does, it will work. I just believe that this is the mechanism that causes it to work. And so in the interest of giving you real wisdom and understanding, I don't want to just give you knowledge. I don't want to just give you facts and techniques. I want you to understand why those techniques work. And so Broca's area is the heart of all this for me. And maybe someday they will discover, no, it's not Broca's area, it's actually some other thing. I doubt that's going to happen, but if it does, always remember, if you move forward as though everything I'm telling you is 1,000% reliable, you will be glad you did. Predictability is the silent assassin of persuasion, of entertainment, and of delight. So, the new, the surprising, and the different, constantly. If you do it too far, if you go too far, and it makes no sense, it causes confusion, disconnect. But if you understand how much to disrupt the pattern, and how to take the musical note to a little different place than where the people expected it to go, you'll experience unbelievable, big benefits from that manipulation. So verbs, Broca's area. Now, the arcuate fasciculus is a high bandwidth bundle of nerves that runs between Broca's area and Wernicke's area. So Wernicke's area and Broca's area, these are the two highly specialized brain regions that only human beings have. And then, of course, we have way more of the mass of our brain devoted to the memory of sound than any other creature. This is, you can tell mammals, what is the superpower of a mammal? You can tell that by the architecture of the brain. And the superpower of human beings is our ability to attach complex meanings to sound, which is why music is so powerful. Remember, I did not say, and Professor Steven Pinker did not say, our ability to attach sounds to words, to create words. No. Pitch, key, tempo, musical interval, musical contour, and rhythm. Those 6 sub-languages of music, those are sounds. And music can move us even when it has no words. It is a language of sound, and we can attach complex meanings to sounds. And so music is a powerful language. Words are a powerful language. And in another session, when we talk about chaotic ad writing, we're going to demonstrate for you what happens when words and music, another interesting duality, come into conflict. When the message of the music disagrees with the message of the words, what happens in the mind of human beings? It's a fun session. I'm anxious for you to go there. But for now, let's move forward. Let's talk about the dorsolateral prefrontal association area. If you put your left hand just in front of your left ear, your forefinger here is on Broca's area, and your pinky is on the prefrontal cortex, the center of all plans, emotions, and judgments, right there. But here, where your forefinger is, just forward of your left ear, that's Broca's area. But in between, the dorsolateral prefrontal association area, between your left ear and your forehead, is the home of working memory. Now, this is another word that scientists have created because they can't agree on a scientific definition for consciousness or awareness. So they made up their own word. They don't even have a definition for imagination. So consciousness, awareness, imagination, they just call it working memory. So it is short-term, it is electrical. It is, in my opinion, consciousness, awareness. It is imagination. It's the RAM, short-term. It's only there for a moment to be replaced by another moment, to be replaced by another moment, but it is not permanent. It is fleeting. It is easily redirected by Broca's area. It is the dorsolateral prefrontal association area where the activity happens, right here, what you think of as consciousness. And the door into that consciousness is Broca's area. Now let's look at this. This is Dr. Marcus Raisley at the Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis. This is microthermal imaging. And notice, again, decisions, plans, and judgments. The pink part, the orientation of this left brain is the same as in the previous brain map. Notice that working memory in the dorsolateral prefrontal association area, awareness, imagination, there's a little bit of red activity going on there, but this is visual stimulation. This is something came into the eyes. See that bright yellow dot way back just above your spine? That bright yellow dot, that means this is a visual thing that has happened, and there's a little bit of activity up there in consciousness. And notice how the red kind of bleeds up into multisensorial mental images. Okay? It's like, okay. So Broca's area is the guy at the nightclub with the velvet rope. And he goes, yeah, seen that, I've seen that, that's old, that's so much last year. Yeah, that's really predictable. Oh, this is new, surprising, and different. And then he comes, the velvet, come on in. Just come on in. We've never seen that before. So evidently there's big enough visual thing is happening. There's a little bit of consciousness and working memory. They got past Broca. They slip. Broca goes, okay, yeah, that's a little bit new, so you go on. We'll consider that. Now remember the goal of all of this is to get to the big boss, the prefrontal cortex right behind your forehead. Because if you can get to the prefrontal cortex, you can get a yes answer. You can get a no answer. You can get a decision. You can make plans. The person's going to make a judgment. But you don't get into the prefrontal cortex until first you get past the guy with the velvet rope, Broca's area. And the only way you get past Broca is to surprise Broca with something new, surprising or different. Surprising Broca is to do or say something just enough unexpected that attention is directed towards you. And this is what they call engagement. You have to win attention constantly over and over and over and over and over. That's called engagement. You can't win it and assume now that I have it, they have to keep listening. No, they don't. You've got them for about 3.5 seconds. That's as long as you've got them. You have to be constantly doing or saying something a little different than they anticipated, or they're going to go away somewhere else in their mind. They're zoned out thinking about something else. You can't afford to let that happen. Now this is what happens when you use sound. Boom. Look at Broca's area. Bam. Bright yellow. Big bright red going up into multisensorial mental images. And look at awareness. They're in the dorsolateral prefrontal. And then there's a tiny little dot. Just look at that. This is a little bit of a bright yellow spot. That's what I call the central executive. Now we've already talked about the visual-spatial sketchpad, and we've talked about the articulatory loop, which is the rehearsal of sound, the third function of working memory. According to Dr. Alan Baddeley and all the other cognitive neuroscientists in the world since 1986, the central executive is basically a high-level messenger that is not looking for new, surprising, or different. You see, that's Broca's job. Broca's area is making sure this is not something we already knew. Now, the central executive of working memory has a whole different job to decide, does this matter? Is it relevant? Do we care? Because if it's new, surprising, or different, Broca lets it into working memory, and then the handoff is to the central executive, who then says, okay, does it matter? Just because it's new, surprising, or different doesn't mean it matters. So you've got two people you've got to get past. One is Broca, one is the central executive of working memory. But when the central executive goes, yeah, this matters, then it goes for a decision, a judgment in the prefrontal cortex. You do not make the sale until you get past Broca, and you have to get past Broca with an element of surprise. Gentle surprise works best. Don't startle Broca, that just irritates people. Surprise Broca, and then deliver relevance so that it matters to the reader, the listener, the viewer. The central executive has to decide this counts. Visual stimulation, auditory. Joseph Albers is a visual scientist, and in his book on visual communication, he says if one says red, which is the name of a color, and there are 50 people listening, it can be expected there will be 50 different reds in their minds, and one can be sure that all these reds will be very different. Now, even when a certain color is specified, which all listeners have seen innumerable times, such as the red of the Coca-Cola sign, which is the same red all over the world, they will still think of many different reds. Even if the listeners have hundreds of reds in front of them from which to choose Coca-Cola red, they will again select quite different colors, and no one can be sure he has found the precise shade of red that is Coca-Cola red. And even if the round red Coca-Cola sign with the white name in the middle of it is actually shown so that everyone focuses on the same red, each will receive the same projection on his retina, but no one can be sure whether each has the same perception. Now wait a minute. This is a visual scientist in an extremely important book still used all over the world in schools. And this is how he opens the book. He goes on to say, when we further consider the associations and reactions which are experienced in connection with the color and with the name, red, probably everyone will diverge again in many different directions. What does this show? He asked. He said, well, first, it is hard, if not impossible, to remember distinct colors. This underscores the important fact that the visual memory is very poor in comparison with our own auditory memory. He said, often the latter, auditory memory, is able to repeat a melody heard only once or twice. Oh, we remember infinitely more of what we hear than what we see. He goes on to say, secondly, the nomenclature of colors, the naming of colors, is most inadequate. Though there are innumerable colors, shades, and tones in daily vocabulary, there are only about 30 color names. Wow. Visual, and then auditory. Visual, and auditory. The nucleus accumbens is interior to Broca's area. So Broca's area is on the outside surface, the cortex, and then go directly into the more primitive part of the brain. That's the pleasure center. Remember, without surprise, there can be no delight. Broca's area of the brain is the part of the brain that detects surprise. And just interior to Broca's area, pleasure. So when we say, without surprise, at least gentle surprise, something new, surprising, and different, there can be no delight. Yeah, the architecture and the organization of the brain demonstrates that. By the way, the human body contains nearly 100 million sensory receptors allowing us to see, hear, taste, touch, and smell physical reality, but the brain contains more than 10,000 billion synapses. Your sensors gather information and send it to working memory, but that which was anticipated, that which was predictable, is immediately rejected by Broca's area. In working memory, whatever is relevant, whatever is interesting is then totaled like an algebraic equation to calculate a net effect. This net effect we call an impression. It comes, in my opinion, from that part of the brain that is multisensorial mental images. Remember, it was yellow, right kind of back here. The thing that I want you to contemplate is the following by another cognitive neuroscientist, Dr. Jorge Martins de Oliveira. He says, our perception does not identify the outside world as it really is, but the way that we are allowed to recognize it as a consequence of transformations performed by our senses. We experience electromagnetic waves not as waves, but as images and colors. We experience vibrating objects not as vibrations, but as sounds. We experience chemical compounds dissolved in air or water, not as chemicals, but as specific smells and tastes. Colors, sounds, smells, and tastes. Dr. Oliveira tells us, are products of our minds built from sensory experiences. They do not exist as such outside our brain. Actually, the universe is colorless, odorless, insipid, and silent. That just freaks me out. So if a tree falls over in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? No. The vibrations go out, but if there's nothing there to translate those vibrations into sound, sound does not exist. Sound exists only in the mind. Colors, smells, and tastes. Yes, the electromagnetic wave is real. But without eyes and a visual cortex to translate those electromagnetic waves into color, color doesn't exist. The electromagnetic wave exists, but it's invisible. Color exists only in your mind. So when I talk about perceptual reality, it's not objective reality, it's perceptual. Perceptual reality is where you will live most of your life alone. It's a private world. Communication happens when the perceptual reality of one person overlaps with the perceptual reality of another person, and where their experiences overlap, and where they have a similar context in which they can communicate, then communication can happen. When the perceptual realities overlap. Without an overlapping of perceptual realities, there's no communication, and you remain alone in your private world. Dr. Jorge Martins de Oliveira goes on to say, although you and I share the same biological architecture and function, perhaps what I perceive as a distinct color and smell is not exactly equal to the color and smell you perceive. We may give the same name to similar perceptions, but we cannot know how they relate to the reality of the outside world. Perhaps we never will. Now, we're going to go a little bit deeper into working memory. I told you this was going to be a little bit of a long session. Working memory, declarative memory, and procedural memory are the three levels of memory in your brain. There's a book published in 1986 called Working Memory by Dr. Alan Baddeley, B-A-D-D-E-L-E-Y. It will tell you everything in the world I'm about to tell you, plus infinitely more. So this is something you can very easily, independently research on your own. Sensory information judged by Broca's area to be sufficiently unusual is allowed to pass through Broca's area. Remember, he's the guy with the little velvet rope. And it thereby enters the dorsolateral prefrontal association area, the home of working memory that we talked about, which is the uppermost, the most shallow of the three levels of memory in the brain. Working memory, number one, is short-term and electrical. Think of it as the RAM in the biological computer. It is imagination, conscious awareness. It is the thought you are thinking now to be replaced by a different thought. Now, the three functions of working memory in the dorsolateral prefrontal are, number one, the visual spatial sketchpad, responsible for the manipulation and temporary storage of visual and spatial information, allowing you to see things in your mind. Seeing things in your mind, the mind's eye, that is the function of the visual spatial sketchpad. Now, we talked about the articulatory loop. That's number two, function of working memory, right there in the dorsolateral prefrontal. It is a phonological memory store which holds acoustic speech or other sounds and rehearses them in the mind. It's a little bit of an echo chamber. Now, the articulatory loop is sometimes called the phonological loop. They're interchangeable terms, but it's this rehearsal of sound in your mind. When something gets stuck in your head, the hook of a song, or a particular phrase or statement, that's the articulatory loop. Number three, the central executive. We talked about him earlier. Right there in the dorsolateral prefrontal is the high-level messenger responsible for determining whether sensory information is of sufficient salience or importance. relevance to warrant passage into the prefrontal cortex, the foremost part of the brain, right up there, responsible for plans, decisions, and judgments. So you have the visual spatial sketchpad, the mind's eye. You have the articulatory loop, that interesting echo chamber, that rehearsal of sound in the mind. And then you have the central executive, the part of working memory that determines whether the thing that's new, surprising, and different that got past Broca is it worthy of being presented to the big boss, the prefrontal cortex. Working memory and the three functions it contains slowly disappear as sleep overtakes the mind, and this biological computer we call the brain is shut down, powered off. The RAM is now gone. Anything not saved to the hard drive is gone forever. When people tell you that somewhere in your brain, if you were hypnotized, everything you've ever experienced, everything you've ever seen or smelled, or anything your eyes have ever taken in or ears have ever heard, it's stored in your brain somewhere. And under hypnosis, maybe they can get you to recall it. Complete and absolute crap. Under hypnosis, can they cause you to remember things that never happened? You bet they can. But the assumption that all the information, all the sensory data that your senses have ever collected was in fact stored in your mind is insane. Every cognitive neuroscientist in the world knows that to be a false assumption. So never let anybody tell you that. It's simply not true. Now, the second level of memory, we've talked about working memory and its three functions. Now we're going to talk about the second level of memory. It's a little bit deeper. It doesn't go away when you go to sleep, at least not immediately. If you go to sleep enough times without rehearsing it and bringing it back, it will go away. It's called declarative memory. It's midterm memory. It's intermediate memory. Think of it as an unreliable hard drive containing information that can be recalled, but only with an effort. Information that is less important or that is not occasionally recalled into working memory, consciousness, will slowly be erased by sleep. Sleep, the great eraser of the mind. And this is the thing we call forgetting. Did you know there are things you used to know that you don't know anymore? They're gone. They weren't important enough, and you didn't think about them for a long time, and they disappeared. Forever. Gone. Now, there are two kinds of declarative memory. First is semantic declarative memory. That's when you can remember the information, but you don't remember where you learned it or who taught it to you. You don't have any context of how you know this. You just remember it. That is semantic declarative memory. Now, episodic declarative memory is when you remember the episode. You not only have the memory, but you remember something about the occasion, the setting, the environment, the moment, the episode in which this memory was obtained. Where did you learn this? That is called episodic memory. So you have semantic, you don't know where you learned it. You have episodic, you have some emotional context for this information that you recall. Therefore, colorful speakers are more likely to create episodic declarative memory. Why? Because there will be an emotional reaction attached to the memory. Never forget that. Emotion is your friend. We'll talk more about that in detail, specifically as it relates to adrenaline, the biochemical adhesive that turns short-term into long-term, involuntary, automatic recall. The third and deepest level of memory is called by cognitive neuroscientists procedural memory. It is automatic, involuntary recall. It is not just electrical, it is literally chemical memory in the brain. Melissa Blevins, who is for many years and probably still is, I haven't talked to her in a couple of years, but she was the head of solid organ transplants at the Mayo Clinic. And she was telling me a number of years ago about a discovery they made that adrenaline is the biochemical adhesive that makes automatic, involuntary recall, implicit knowledge. The more adrenaline, the more likely it goes into long-term, automatic, involuntary recall. That can be bad in terms of panic attacks with PTSD. It can be good in terms of remembering the name of a company or a product automatically and involuntarily whenever you have a need for that product or service. So, how do you trigger adrenaline, even a microburst of adrenaline? Well, if something is new or surprising or different, that's a first step. And if it's very, very relevant, if it really matters, that would be good too. And you know that you've accomplished both of these. If a person laughs, cries, or gets angry, they don't have to get angry at you. They can get angry about the thing you're talking about. But if fear, rage, joy, or laughter are involved, you've got some adrenaline in the blood. And that long-term involuntary automatic recall is far more likely to happen. Make them laugh, cry, or get angry. Emotions trigger long-term involuntary automatic recall. Now, up until now, we've been talking about the left hemisphere of the brain, specifically how the brain gathers, stores, processes, and retrieves information from each of its different regions in the left hemisphere. But this pattern recognition, this emotion, this personality, this thing that isn't rational, sequential, deductive reasoning, that's all left brain. The stuff that isn't left brain is right brain. Now, this is not technically accurate, but I'm going to give you a way to think about the left and right hemispheres that isn't entirely accurate, but it's a way to just make it easier to talk about, okay? Can we have that agreement that I acknowledge this isn't 100% accurate or even close to 100%, but it's directionally true, all right? Think of the left hemisphere of the brain, the rational, sequential, deductive reasoning part of the brain as the mind, the intellect, the mind. And think of the right brain as the heart and the mind, the heart and the mind, the intellect and the feelings. So when you talk about intellect and emotion, you're talking about left brain and right. You ultimately have to win both. But did you know that in advertising and marketing, far, far, far too much emphasis is put upon the left hemisphere of the brain, the rational, sequential, deductive reasoning brain. And the unguarded, willing to believe anything, doesn't know fact from fiction part of the brain, is the right hemisphere. If you speak to the heart, the mind will follow, because the heart can always help the mind create logic to justify what the heart has already decided. So win the heart. Look briefly with me at 3 different functions of procedural memory, which is that long-term automatic involuntary recall. And then I'm going to give you your assignment. Number 1, conditioned reflexes. Something runs out in front of the car, you don't think about hitting the brake, it's automatic, involuntary. You hit the brake. Why? Repetition and relevance. You've done it so many times. The repetition and the relevance make it automatic and involuntary. Number 2, when you have a skill or a habit, such as learning to play the piano, or swinging a golf club, or shooting free throws from the free throw line in basketball, or swinging a bat or a hockey stick, tennis racket, and doing it correctly, is not just a function of repetition. It's also influenced heavily by relevance. The more you love the sport or the art, the easier it is for you to learn, because the higher the relevance, the less repetition is required. The lower the relevance, the more repetition is required. Have you figured out yet? The cognitive neuroscientists learned years ago, long-term, involuntary, automatic recall, what they call procedural memory, what you and I would call branding, okay? Being the name they think of first and feel the best about when they finally need what you sell. Guess what? It is relevance times repetition. The cognitive neuroscientists know this, and now you do too. The third thing is emotional associations, branding, to implant an associative memory with a recall cue. When you describe a situation that you know the reader, the listener, the viewer, the customer is going to experience someday, when you describe the moment and then name your product or service as the solution to the pain of that moment or the frustration of that moment, bam. When you speak to the heart, the right brain, bang. They encode that, if you do it skillfully, with surprise and delight, with wit and charm. Speak to the heart, win the mind. Information of extremely high relevance can enter into long-term procedural memory with only one repetition. Now, at the time of this recording, something that everybody remembers is 9/11. And whenever terrorists flew jets into the World Trade Center, everybody remembers exactly where they were when they heard about it. They remember who told them. They remember their thoughts. They remember their first view of it. They remember the moment as though it happened merely hours ago. And that moment only occurred once. The relevance, it was extremely new, surprising, and different. And it was high relevance, such high relevance, so surprising, that went into long-term involuntary automatic recall with clarity, with a repetition of only one. One time is all you had to experience it. Now that only happens a few times in your life. If you have information of lower relevance, it's going to require more repetition. Information that's less interesting must be repeated more often to be remembered. Now, we're trying to talk to you, we're trying to teach you how to be more easily remembered. Why? Because repetition costs money. Being a great communicator allows you to achieve your objective for less money. Less repetition, deeper impression, less repetition, therefore lower ad budget. Branding occurs in procedural memory, that long-term involuntary automatic type of memory. When you create an associative memory, a memory that becomes linked to another memory, when you create that associative memory in your ads, because of the words you use and how you reinforce those words with shapes and colors and symbols and facial expressions and tones of voice and all the other things you have at your disposal. The recall cue is need. The customer's need triggers a chemical procedural memory, and then your name or the name of your product or company pops into their mind automatically and involuntarily. We're going to wrap this up with the following statement by Professor Steven Pinker. Steven with a V. You're going to want to Google that. The chair of the Department of Brain and Cognitive Science at MIT and then now Harvard. Steven says, the human brain, too, tells a story. Our brains are about 3 times too big for a generic monkey or ape of our size. The major lobes and patches of the brain are different as well. The olfactory bulbs, which underlie the sense of smell, have shriveled to 1/3 of the expected primate size, which is already puny by mammalian standards. And the main cortical areas for vision have shrunk proportionally as well. In other words, our sense of smell is very poor, and our ability to see is very poor compared to most animals. He goes on, while the areas for hearing, especially for understanding speech, have grown to twice what a primate our size should have. Now I'm going to give you your assignment. There are going to be 2 things you're going to write about. First, you're going to speak to the mind, the left hemisphere of the brain, and that's going to require logic, details. It's going to require information. Logic, details, information. And the thing that you have chosen to write about, you're going to write between 150 and 180 words. That's your window. Do not write less than 150. Do not write more than 180. And you're going to speak to the mind. You're going to write about the precise same product or service. You're going to frame it differently in that you're not going to speak to the mind. You're going to speak to the heart with a second 150 to 180 words. 150 to 180 written to the left hemisphere, the mind. Another 150 to 180 separate presentation written to the heart, the right brain. Now listen, What does the right brain want? The right brain wants emotions, feelings, context, relationships between things. It wants to see the pattern. It wants to see the connectedness. It wants to know where this rates in the big picture. What is it part of? Where does it belong? And what is its context to other things around it? Remember, pattern recognition and emotion. But don't think pattern as a visual thing. Think of pattern as, where does this thing belong in my life? What is it related to? What is it connected to? Why does it matter to me? How do I feel about it? And more importantly, how does it make me feel? And so let me put it this way. This is some worn out language, but if you really need to use this language, or if I need to use this language to help you understand, think of it as features and benefits. Features are left brain, benefits are right brain. Benefits speak to the heart, the actual experience of the customer. What does it let me do I couldn't do before? What problem goes away? And how do I feel when I can do what I couldn't do? Or how do I feel when the problem has gone away? You're going to have fun understanding the difference between the mind and the heart. You're going to get it for the first time, this duality that you've lived within and that you've felt the tension between those two things your entire life. Good luck. We're really anxious to see what you write.